Some clarification on savings. You know, this is the, this the Congress is very interested in savings for good reason. And we know that there should be an incentive to use cloud first. We know that's the government's policy because you pay for the service you use. And yet we have contrarian responses. There are some agencies, apparently, where it would be cheaper to stay with the data center. I don't understand why, but that is apparently the case. But I was frankly shocked to read a column yesterday about, and here's a figure that was in the column. It's called My Cup of IT, Steve O'Keefe. GAO tells us feds spend 69% of the $81 billion IT budget on hospice care for geriatric systems. You know, but let's leave aside his characterization for the moment. But it would seem to imply that these systems are long past their usual usable lives, and yet it looks like the lion's share of money is spent on propping them up. Why aren't agencies rushing toward cloud, saving themselves money, and doing what the government's policy says they should be doing in the first place? Either one of you can answer that question. I'd appreciate it.
I'll take the first take on it. I think the challenge that we often face is the capital expenditure it takes to make the transformation. You often can't just pick up a system you have and just move it to the cloud. You actually have to spend money to do that. And
so is the administration budgeting for the capital expenditure?
In many cases we are, but in this fiscal environment, my approach has been, let's go find savings where we can, where we find low-hanging fruit, and then reinvest those savings. So my budget guidance I put out to agencies, for example, was to cut 10% of their IT budget in targeted areas, and I gave them the target areas, things around that we've just been discussing today, commodity IT and other places where it doesn't take that capital lever to move. And then to net to a 5% down, I gave them 5% of that 10 back to say, okay, now this is capital, you should be investing in these new areas. And the new areas should be focused on systems modernization, cybersecurity, employee productivity, or citizen-facing services, making those run in a better way. And what you'll see going forward is, and then I ran the portfolio stat process to help them find that 10% within their agency in a very data-driven way. We went and analyzed all the commodity IT systems they were running and things. And so this is a spirit that I'm trying to inject into government. You know,
because it looks like for some time now there's not going to be the capital. I mean, the cloud is an ideal. A cloud is what we'd like to see, but let's face it, if it takes, like so much of IT, if it takes heavy capital investment, it just can't happen for some time. It's going to happen very gradually, isn't that so?
That's right. Unless you inspire this let's examine what's working, what's not working, take what's not working, cut it, and then move it in. Government.
So have you all ever done a cost benefit? I mean, would it be worth it to speed it up because of the savings, or is this just not something we could bring money to bear on at this time, no matter what?
In certain cases, definitely it'd be advantageous. But what you have to be careful about is looking at you don't want to just take bad behavior that's local and move that bad behavior to the cloud. You should think about, how am I re-architecting these systems? And that's part of the underlying work we're doing, thinking about these open architectures and modular design and things that are going to be evolutionary as well as revolutionary in their approach.
What about these? Well, what kinds of agencies are there where it would be cheaper to stay with the data center than to go to the cloud?
I don't think, in an aggregate world, I don't think it is cheaper in many cases that they would not be running to the cloud provider. Where it's more around, do I have the money today to invest to move that capital expenditure? And I think the cheapness equation comes in a single year view, because that's the way we budget in many agencies, versus the long year. We often see this with federal real estate, where it would be cheaper to buy a new building than rent, an expensive building, or things like that, where the capital expenditure to move is challenging.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My only concern is if these systems are really as old and presumably unreliable as is implied by this columnist, I really do wonder about cybersecurity. and about investing in cybersecurity and such old systems, only to have to reinvest it when the cloud comes.
The gentlelady would yield.
I'd gladly yield to the Chairman.
Perhaps there's one salient point that you'd appreciate of the 75% or so of the budget spent on legacy systems. Some of them are so internal and can only be run locally, and they're operating on obsolete computers and obsolete operating systems, and they're written in COBOL, they're written in Fortran, they're not able to process through the cloud at all. They're pretty much hack-proof. That's the one good part, is they don't go into cyberspace, therefore they actually...
You mean all that hacking is done on only cloud systems that we read about every other day?
Well, I think the gentleman would probably tell you that some of the systems he looks at do not, in fact, have a portal for remote access through an Internet-based process.
That's right.
That's not the good part. I'm just saying it's so bad that hackers can't even bother to go back. There aren't old enough hackers for it, perhaps.
Be grateful for small favors.
If the gentleman from Virginia would give me a dispensation. The gentlelady from Illinois and the gentleman from, where the heck are you from?
Wisconsin.
Wisconsin, Madison, Wisconsin, returned so promptly. Would you mind if I took one of them first?
Go right ahead, Mr. Chairman. I was just going to say, thank you for making that point, though. Who knew that actually obsolete and antiquated systems were helping in the fight against cyber attacks? Thank you.
Now, you two figure out which one of you go. The gentlelady is recognized. Smart move.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I hope to build on the bipartisan nature that you've started these hearings today with my question, which is really one coming from a freshman Democrat who is concerned about a governor's rights and states' rights. Specifically, 95% of our military support to civilians within the homeland is conducted at the state level through state active duty status, which is funded out of state coffers, or Title 32 funded state missions, which are federally funded. I am concerned about a governor's ability to command and control his forces, such as during a natural disaster, if we defund his state IT network and attempt to replace it with a federal solution that may prioritize federal military missions over National Guard, homeland, domestic operations. I'm concerned that building a new federal solution, such as an IT backbone, purchase of routers, the like, could be more costly than continuing to fund existing IT solutions that the states have already built to meet their specific mission requirements. Louisiana and New Jersey have very different needs than my home state of Illinois, although some remain the same. And they have different commercial IT networks that can be leveraged. I would like to see federal and state governments leverage existing commercial networks for cost savings wherever possible, rather than pay to build new solutions. I'm also wary of infringing on a governor's ability to command his or her National Guard forces. I'm concerned that those, as I see it, consolidating of IT is a great thing, but it does set up a tension between the DoD federal priorities and the state priorities. It works well to consolidate for federal Title X mission support, but tends to prioritize the governor's National Guard forces below active component for funds. This low priority threatens the ability of Guard forces to respond to and coordinate efforts, and really for the governor to remain in control of his or her state active duty and Title 32 forces. So I have two questions, and either gentleman can choose to answer. The first question is this: how does the centralized federal IT acquisition process support military operations at the state level? And my follow-on question is, are there any safeguards that would ensure that state IT requirements, missions, such as under state active duty or Title 32 missions, can be given the same priority as the federal forces under Title X? Thank you.
Clearly, the gentlelady is not new to asking questions.
Yeah, obviously. That's great. I'm not a subject matter expert on the tactical aspects of technology deployment at the state level, so especially the second question, I think I would love to take back for the record and get you a response that is much better than one I would postulate myself. But on the first, the military at the state level and thinking about integrated acquisition at that level, one of the things I think we do pretty well and are getting much better at is setting up more centralized requirement gathering. One of the main challenges we see both on the federal side and the private sector side working with the federal government to supply services is the unpredictability. When we're unpredictable in our procurement of cloud computing, for example, prices tend to go up, variability in cyber protection goes up, and other challenges are presented. And so we'll definitely work with the Office of Federal Procurement Policy and DoD to get you an answer to this. But I think the essence of this is going to be around not necessarily just setting up a one-size-fits-all for the entire country, but more around how are we coming together as a community to solve a common mission purpose around a set of predictable requirements, but flexible requirements that allow variability at the state level, I think is essential.
Right. And I think it's a very specific case. It's a very narrow situation. You rarely have this type of situation where it's the same entity that has both a federal and a state mission. I just want to make sure that we're not infringing on a governor's right and to control his or her forces when they are under that state active duty or Title 32, and to make sure that that is given the same priority by DoD, because if DoD gets these access or control over the funds, the acquisition funds for the entire military, including Guard, they would naturally, I would assume, prioritize Title 10 or active duty missions over the equally important state missions. And I just want to make sure that there's some way to ensure that those state requirements as set forth by the governor are well respected.
Great.
Thank you, Mr.
Would the gentlelady yield for just a second?
Gladly, sir.
When you're answering her question, would you sort of try to, the best extent you can, include how we best leverage, either through this Act or other things that you're currently doing, the dollars being spent federally being made available, if you will, for cheap or free to the states? In other words, our procurement falling to their benefit, and particularly if you look at source code where a state may choose to modify the software, but they have to be able to get the software and source code basically at no cost for the federal use, and then be able to add on their hooks for the state. And I think that's a big part of what the gentlelady is speaking about. If you could answer how you envision that, I think the committee would appreciate it. Thank you. We now go to the gentleman from Virginia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to ask 3 categories of questions, and I'm going to do it as fast as I can, and I ask you to be as fast as you can. Process. It seems to me that when you compare it to the private sector, the federal process is hopelessly out of date and not at all suited for this kind of IT procurement. You've got long lead times. By the time we've figured out the RFP, we've figured out the contract award process, we've awarded the contract, we've set the terms, we've dealt with the protests, the technology has already passed us by, or the mission technologically has been redefined necessarily. And we don't seem to be very flexible in addressing that. And that's to say nothing of the fact that we have the stovepipe process all over the place. The Chairman has pointed out that we have 243 CEOs. That sounds like way too many. What could go wrong with that in terms of accountability, a point of decision-making? It seems almost a system to make sure there is no accountability. Your comments, both of you, on process.
That's a very valid point on the long lead times. And if you look at many of these large acquisitions, the time between major milestones sometimes is years, and that's still the case. I think Steve's comments earlier about modular development, we need to have the procurement side of the house aligned with the technology side of the house. So modular contracting along with development is clearly where we need to go so that we can get a bit more modern here in the Federal Government. When you look at the CIO issue, yeah, there are a lot of CIOs across the Federal Government. The thing we like, and we've been looking at large-scale IT acquisition problems for years now at the Government Accountability Office, is having the dashboard where you have a single CIO accountable at these major departments and agencies. It allows you to go to some place to get questions answered. And that actually caused a lot of problems when the dashboard was rolled out because there wasn't a single person to go to. and there was a lot of scrambling that needs to go on to get status. We're still probably feeling the effects of that. We like that model where there's a single CIO, whether you have other CIOs or you figure out the reporting. That's what's really needed.
Okay. Mr. Van
I think on your 2 points, first the process on long lead, I couldn't agree more on that is a big challenge. I think part of the solution to this is in existing law and exists in the realm of myth busting, where we are explaining to agencies there are new ways and new approaches of doing this. The two that are most encouraging to me one are just flexible contracts, having an open contract where when you need a resource, you need a developer to develop some solution, you need something done, you can call upon them and bill as you go. We've seen that as a great model. The second is modular contracting, as Mr. Powner said, getting agencies to embrace modularity, smaller deliverables that can be done in a much faster pace, really ups the level of both quality and agility on their ability to deliver. Joe Jordan and I delivered just this in 2012 modular contracting guidance for agencies that is new policy around teaching both the acquisition community and the IT community how to deliver on modular. On the number of CIOs, I think from a titling perspective, we have a lot of CIOs, and I think there are many cases where there's span of control and some governance challenges that we need to get our arms around. Thus, the first memo I issued out of my office that went right to the heart of this. I think part of the solution to that is first getting all those CIOs out of the job of things that should be centralized across their agency. Having multiple email systems at an agency doesn't make sense. You should run one. Having multiple.
When you were at our field forum, I thought you said at one agency they had like 36 email systems?
Yeah. Over 20, I think is what I said, and that same agency over 1,000 mobile contracts. They now have one. It's one email system. It's a third of the cost. And the 1,000 mobile contracts went to a few blanket purchase ones, which is massive. So if you get CIOs at the fringe out of the business of managing that commodity stuff and more focused on the mission of their division or their agency or their bureau, you can really up the quality of the citizen services and the effectiveness of that agency, and that's part of the magic of the mix, I think.
I'm going to run out of time, so I'm not going to get to all three of the things that I think the Chairman and I are both trying to look at in the legislation list. The Chairman wants to be a little generous here. I'm trying to lay some intellectual.
Start asking before you run out of time. The gentleman, ask unanimous consent. The gentleman have an additional minute without objection. So ordered.
I thank the Chair. Tom Davis testified about procurement personnel. That's one of our problems, the lack of skill set. Often, the person selling has a higher skill set than the person purchasing. Your views about that problem in the Federal Government?
I agree that that's a challenge. You often have the person doing innovation in an agency, not the person that also purchases, and that there's a divide there. What we're encouraging, and this is coming straight out of the Office of Federal Procurement Policy, is first is integrated program teams, getting those communities, human capital, acquisitions, IT, finance, and others sitting around the table, as I mentioned earlier, and getting involved with integrated acquisition teams on specific projects that are of high priority is just so essential to have everyone sitting around the table. And the second is IT acquisition cadres, getting areas of expertise and specialization within agencies that can focus on certain solutions or certain challenges. Negotiating a very effective mobile contract with a mobile carrier is not easy, and there's some complexity in that. If you have a team in government that focuses on it and thinks about it, that's a recipe for success.
I thank the gentleman.
I thank the Chair.
We now recognize the gentlelady from Wyoming for her questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Pownell, I apologize if this question has already been brought up in my absence. But my question is, we know that agencies are supposed to analyze legacy systems and try to keep ahead of the technology curve, but we also understand from GAO's work that many are not doing that. Can you describe the extent of that problem and perhaps include in your answer roughly how many billions are being spent on IT programs for which we have no analysis of where the agency is on its technology curve?
Well, let's just talk about framing how much we spend on legacy systems. So of the $80 billion, roughly, you have $55 billion, or 70% is being spent on legacy systems. There's a very good requirement that OMB has that on an annual basis, each of the legacy systems need to be evaluated. And basically what it asks for is this, is it continuing to meet the mission needs, and can it be done in a much more efficient way? So with the discussion we had prior about going to the cloud, perhaps we can go to the cloud and do it much cheaper. There's also things we could do with back-end systems. If you really went in and analyzed some of these old archaic legacy systems, there are tweaks we could do and make that pot of $55 billion, we could spend that much more efficiently going forward. Cloud is clearly one way to get there. What we did is we looked at a small sample. We looked at 5 agencies in the review that you're talking about. And what we saw was the Department of Homeland Security and Health and Human Services, they actually had a policy and they were doing these operational analysis. Now, they weren't doing them well in all cases, but they had a policy and they were doing them. We had agencies like DOD, VA, and Treasury, no policy. And the year that we looked at, they didn't do a single operational analysis. So what we found in our little samples, we had about $3 billion in systems that were not evaluated. So that $3 billion investment, technically that could have been invested much more efficiently if we looked at that in the appropriate manner.
Up for Mr. Van Rokel. So knowing that, and I assume this is not new information to you, knowing that, what's your plan for all agencies to complete operational analysis? And when should we expect full compliance? And I say that with the caveat that we've been waiting for a clean audit from DOD forever. They've never had one. And so now to hear that DOD is one of the agencies that has not completed this analysis is not surprising either. But do you have a plan to get these people on board?
So it's our expectation that both through our policy and accountability mechanisms that agencies will step up. And we've made a lot of improvements, as I think has been highlighted a little bit here today, on IT dashboard to expose some of the areas where we think the quality of the information that's being submitted isn't there, or it's just lacking altogether. One of the features that we've added is data quality reports that actually look at if a date is unrealistic, if numbers don't line up, if due dates are too far out. That's actually now highlighted on the IT dashboard to build a level of accountability for these agencies. That coupled with our budget guidance, which is putting a lot of pressure on agencies to really examine these legacy systems, I think are elements of how we're going to get there. You know, something I used every day, because I was part of a team that ran a pretty large P&L within the private sector company I was part of, was depreciation. You know, we thought every day about how do we wind down the things we've done in the past in order to fund the things going forward. In the public, you know, we used our balance sheet as a strategic tool. In the public sector, we tend to use the balance sheet just as an auditing tool, just to check back on how we've done. And a clean audit is success versus are we properly managing this turnover of old and giving to new, stealing from the OPEX column to give to the CAPEX column. And so the budget guidance gets right to the heart of this, and I think will inspire more action than actually doing oversight assessments through the IT dashboard. By telling agencies you need to cut 10% and you need to take 5% of that and put it back into the top of your priority list, I think we'll start to see more turnover. And definitely from a trending analysis, looking at where that the old system support is going, we're now starting to see it, which is very encouraging.
And Mr. Chairman, one more question. For either of you, have you seen a state that represents the best practice among states in getting a handle on these same issues? I know in my state, I was in all 3 branches of state government during different times in my life, and in every branch of state government, we struggled with these very issues, especially in the executive branch. So is there a state that has that's the leader in this, that even the federal government could look to for some streamlining?
If you say Wyoming, you'll get a lot of points here.
Illinois, Wisconsin.
Illinois will work too.
I don't know if I
Southern California.
I don't know if I can point to one state, but I will say this because we do a lot of work with the National Association of State CIOs. And I think when you look at the budget situation in a number of states across the country, they were forced to consolidate data centers. They had no choice. Things were getting cut, and they needed to find ways to lower their overall budgets. So there are a number of states that I'm aware of through the National Association of State CIOs, but they face very similar problems. They're trying to put in place dashboards so they get better performance on their large acquisitions. But I do think you'll see many success stories at the state level on data center consolidation.
And the other thing we're seeing at the state level is groups of states now getting together and saying, let's create a regional authority to look at sharing procurements, sharing technology, and sharing other things. And that's been very successful as well.
Excellent. Mr. Pocan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I would say so.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen. I'm just going to ask one question, and I'm going to try to yield my time back to Mr. Connolly so he can get his third question in. Mr. Pauner, I know there's been some progress made in the consolidating data centers, but your GAO report highlighted that many agencies have failed to produce complete data center inventories and plans, and the vast majority, even the basic requirements such as schedules and cost estimates, and that without these plans and inventory, there's a lack of consistency among agencies. It's difficult to summarize projections. I was just wondering, based on your research, why are so many agencies failing to complete these requirements?
So a couple comments here. There are, we looked for two periods of time looking at data center consolidation inventories and plans. And you're right. The last time we looked, last we reported there were 3 agencies that had complete inventories. That was SSA, HUD, and National Science Foundation. And then only 1 agency had a complete plan when you look at the requirements that were laid out by OMB, and that was the Department of Commerce. Some agencies like DOD really struggle to get their arms around their inventories. It's somewhat expected. But our point is that you need to keep on the task, make sure that you identify all those centers that are out there so that you can look to optimize, consolidate, and ultimately save money. There's been a lot of good work. I mean, we now know there are almost 3,000 data centers across the Federal Government. There's been this goal to close about 1,200 of them. Ultimately, you want to get to a point where you get away from the inventories and plans and you get down to the action on actual optimization and consolidation. And that's really what we're looking for with our recommendations going forward. You want the sound baselines, that's clear, but ultimately it's about the actions. And that's why I say when you look at the ultimate performance metric on data center consolidation, whether you're talking consolidation, optimization, it's dollar savings. And if DOD says there's $2.2 billion, there's probably more than that. And I think the estimate of $3 billion that OMB has, it's likely more than that also.
Great. Thank you. I'd just like to yield my time to Mr. Connolly.
I thank my colleague. And the third set of questions I wanted to ask, again, referring to the testimony of our former colleague, the former chairman of this committee, Tom Davis, he talked about how budgets matter, especially when we put ourselves on a continuing resolution. He actually said it stifles innovation. It sets us back in terms of thoughtful Federal IT procurement. I want to give you both an opportunity to comment on that, your views about that.
When I was in the private sector implementing solutions and technology or even building products, we, about 2 days after the beginning of the fiscal year, we would get our full year budget. And of course, we had to make adjustments based on quarterly returns and things, since we are a large enough division to affect the stock price and other parts of the balance sheet. But in large part, we were able to predict not only what our operating budget was that year, but based on certain other parameters, we could make investments that were around solutions that were going out into out years. I could say I'm going to incubate a product, I'm going to build it, and it's going to take 4 years to do it, but it's going to have this much ROI at the end of that. In the Federal Government, we often face a situation where we get to back-to-back CRs or other elements where the money that is budgeted is allocated so late in the fiscal year that you have 2 to 3 months, if that, often to not only procure what you're hoping to procure once you know the money you have, but then try to implement and get things done in time. And that's a real limiter on the ability to drive innovation and a long-term view of where you could go with some of this. We've seen capital budgeting and some other things in government be helpful in that area.
Mr. Powner?
Well, in addition to innovation, I know I do work specifically on weather satellites. And there's been situations where with the weather satellites, that they're very important. You look at polar orbiting satellites in this country, they were essential to predicting the Sandy superstorm. That was a real success story in terms of the accuracy of when that storm hit. It was spot on due to these weather satellites. And I know the current acquisition on those satellites has been affected in a negative way due to some CRs.
Well, I thank you both very much. I do think it's another constraint we have to look at in terms of our own process in Congress and how perhaps unwittingly we contribute to some of the problems in the whole process of Federal IT procurement. Thank you both so much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank my colleague.
Thank you. Would the gentleman further yield? Thank you. I just want to have something answered for the record. This committee took a keen interest under both Mr. Waxman and Mr. Davis in the failures of FTS 2000, the telecommunications modernization. At least at the last time that we had a hearing, what we found was that agencies had simply refused, they didn't say refused, but never implemented the cost savings that came with modernization. We now have, it's now been renamed in 2009, networks, and many agencies are still struggling to, if you will, take advantage of cost savings of buying better telecommunications for less. And as we talk about the cloud, obviously, if you don't have a low-cost, high-speed Internet connection, you're going to also resist the cloud. So could you, there's no time left right now, but either at the end or in writing, if you'd answer on your vision of where we go there, because tangentially, it's part of the problem. With that, we recognize the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Duncan.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And it seems to me that this is a pretty important subject, and I appreciate your calling this hearing. And I think almost every member should be upset or should be at least concerned if they would read what was in our committee memorandum, and it says, despite spending more than $600 billion over the past decade, too often Federal IT budgets run over budget, behind schedule, or never deliver on the promised solution. And it says, some industry experts have estimated that as much as 70% of new Federal IT acquisitions fail or require rebaselining. 70%. I mean, that's almost a shocking figure that I don't think we would accept in almost any other field. And that comes just a week and a half ago, I read in the New York Times a story that said the conversion to electronic health records has failed so far to produce the hoped-for savings in health care costs and has had mixed results at best. It said optimistic predictions by RAND in 2005 helped drive explosive growth in the electronics records industry, and yet it says this 2005 report that helped lead to all this explosion in technical equipment for the Federal Government was paid for by a group of companies including General Electric and Cerner Corporation that have profited by developing all this equipment. And so often in other committees I've heard whenever a government agency messes up, they always say one of two things or both. They say they're underfunded or their technology is outmoded or out of date, and yet the technology in the Federal Government is usually much newer than anything that most of the private sector has. And I was thinking about this a few minutes ago, and I thought back to something that former Governor Rendell, when he was mayor of Philadelphia many years ago, he was having trouble with city employee unions, and he testified in front of the House Ways and Means Committee, and he said that government does not work because it was not designed to. He said there's no incentive for people to work hard, so many do not. There's no incentive for people to save money, so much of it is squandered. And what I keep seeing in this, the only people who really understand this subject are techies who want us to buy all the newest and latest equipment and all the bells and whistles, even though we really can't afford it. And it's not cost effective. It's not producing the results that we're paying for. And so I guess the only real question I have is either of you think of any way that we could put more good federal employees, since the money to buy all this new equipment and spend all these mega billions each year is not coming out of their pockets, so they don't really have any incentive or any pressure to hold down these costs or not buy new equipment every year or every other year? Is there some way that we can get some incentives or pressures to do better? I mean, surely we sure need to do better in this area.
I very much agree. I'm in my job now largely because of that fact, and I think we're able to have much of the conversation. You were able to cite some of the statistics you were in your comments because we're making progress in these areas. The accountability mechanism of the IT dashboard, the ability for us to put a public-facing website up that says, here's what we're doing in government and IT, here's where people are implementing certain technologies, here's what's happening, down to a very granular level with new features being added to that all the time, is creating a really interesting dynamic of accountability relative to those to the delivery against those federal projects and priorities. I think that's part of the equation. I also think we need to change the way we do business inside government. The way we build solutions is a very mid 20th century, mid to late 20th century kind of view, where in the 21st century we have a much different model of building solutions. When I was building products at Microsoft, I wouldn't have thought to take a government-like approach to anything. It was all about speed and modularity and the ability to build in a very fast way high-quality outcomes. And in the government, that hasn't been the norm, to your comments, and I think we have the ability to change that through good policy, which we're implementing now.
All right. Mr. Powner? You see my point? I mean,
yeah.
I own two cars. One's a 2003 and one's a 2006. But if somebody else was paying for it, I might be out there trying to get one that's got better, newer equipment. And I think that's the problem.
I do agree with Steve's comments about the dashboard. I think the accountability through the dashboard, we have someone who's responsible for those investments, and if they're not being delivered appropriately, there needs to be accountability. Someone needs to be able to answer to that, because there's a lot of dollars. We're talking about $80 billion we spend here. I'll give you an example. In the report, my written statement, we did a report looking at successful IT acquisitions. So we went to the top 10 spenders, and we said, give us one example of a success story where something was delivered, it's in operations, users are using it, and it was somewhere in the ballpark at cost and schedule. And there's 7 examples. 7 agencies gave us one. And that includes DOD, and you can read about those projects in there. But there were 3 agencies couldn't give us one. 3 agencies could not give us one success story of a mission-critical system that was delivered recently. That's sad, and someone should be held accountable for that. If we're spending $4, $5, $6 billion at these agencies and they can't give you one success story,
maybe we should come up with some bonus programs for federal employees who save us money in this area in some way. Thank you very much.
I thank the gentleman. For the record, would you mind doing some quick research on the 3 agencies that couldn't give you any examples, and find out whether they had contracts that paid bonuses and whether or not employees received bonuses for overseeing those contracts that they couldn't give you, to the extent that you can. As we close, this committee has taken note in the past of FedRAMP, something your predecessor began. We thought and still believe that it shows great promise. My understanding is, to date, we don't have, out of the 5 tests, if you will, up and running sites that can be sold, that are FSMA compliant, that can be sold across the government. If you would answer for the record your vision of how you get from 0 to 5 or more, and any other information you'd like to give us, that will probably be a follow-up hearing.
Yes, sir. We're actually at 1 right now, as of the last couple of weeks.
Conditional or provisional?
Authority to operate, yes.
Okay. I understood they were provisional in some way. Is that just a
No,
term?
we have one vendor that does have an official
That's
authority
full-
to operate.
Okay, so there's
through
one
our-
to sell.
That's right. And we have 78 in the pipeline behind them. And we're processing through the pipeline right now those 78. So you'll start to see more and more coming online in short order. And
Excellent.
we expect 2013 will be a big year for getting vendors online with FedRAMP.
Okay, well, I appreciate that. That's an area where we'd like to have a good news story. I'd like to thank our panel. You've been very patient through the votes. And with that, we'll set up for the next panel.